an argument for Christianity. It's peculiar in its own way. So it's going to be a cumulative case with which I will demonstrate the explanatory power of Christianity and how it accounts for theism as we know it. So let's begin. In this part, I'll be proposing the arguments. And before I do that, there's this general tendency that we tend to have, this fideist tendency. And it is that religion and, or faith and reason are not exactly compatible. They do not go together. They cannot intermesh, right? And you'd have to suspend your reason if you are going to have to, argue for the Christian faith, for instance. But that is not exactly true, particularly when we read the Bible. For instance, in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, in the New Testament, it makes us to understand, or Paul rather makes us to understand, that the invisible quality of God, or the invisible attributes of God, or invisible nature of God, it depends on the translation that you read, has been made plain unto everybody, such that everybody can see and no man is without excuse, right? The same thing applies when you read Psalms chapter 19, verse 1, where it says that, the heavens declare his glory and the firmament showeth his handiworks, or the firmament or the skies shows the handwork of God, in a sense that I could look at this chair, for instance, and then know that it is not a product of random chance, right? Or it didn't just spontaneously just generate, right? I know that it was somebody who fashioned the chairs. So Paul makes us to understand, and David in the Old Testament, that when you look at the world around you, it looks like the work of somebody that was made. In philosophy, that's what you will call contingency, right? Something that has the appearance of being made. And so I developed an argument that I put in a syllogistic form. It has two premises and one conclusion. The first premise is, if Christian theism is true, it will entail superior explanatory power. Premise 2, Christian theism entails superior explanatory power, and the conclusion leads, therefore, that Christianity, therefore, is true. Now, the first two premises are what you would call axioms, right? Axioms are essentially facts, what you believe to be true, right? Those are axioms. And if the second axioms follow from the first axiom, then it automatically means that the conclusion has to follow. So in my following presentation, I will try and demonstrate the first two axioms, then it automatically leads to the conclusion. Next slide. So the first thing that I'll be putting forward is the cosmological argument, right? Right from the age of antiquity, particularly the medieval era, I think Sammy touched on that, he mentioned Aquinas. We had a tradition of theists, they could be Muslims, they could be Christians, who put forward cosmological arguments to demonstrate the existence of God. And there are three main traditions. I mentioned Thomism, for instance, that is named after Thomas Aquinas. And then we have, the Kalam cosmological argument. We have John Philophonius, who argued from the 4th century. We also have the Mutakalimun. The Mutakalimun are a group of Muslims who used reason to argue for the existence of God. A notable name would be Al-Ghazali, right? Who put forward the Kalam cosmological arguments that will be later popularized by William Lane Craig, right? And then the third tradition, which is my favorite arguments that I like to use, is the contingency argument, which was propounded by Gottfried Leibniz. Gottfried Leibniz is a mathematician and logician, right, of the Enlightenment period as well. So the argument that I'll be using to demonstrate the existence of God very quickly is the contingency argument. It's not a new argument, like I said. It's very old. So the Leibnizian cosmological argument says that, 1, anything that exists has an explanation of its own existence. I'll come to the one in bracket. And then 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. 3, the universe exists. 4, therefore, the universe has an explanation for its existence. And 5, therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. Now let's go to premise 1. It says that anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Now, we know that the very act of hearing my voice is me speaking sound waves into this mic, and then it is being amplified by the speakers onto you. The sonic waves that, go through your ear, through which you hear, is the effects. The cause is me, right? The very act of flipping open this laptop is an effect of me placing my hand and, opening up. The very act of seeing, photons generated from this lamp is that somebody put it on. Every cause has a result, or rather, every resultant effect has a cause. And when we look at the universe as a whole, it seems as if, it doesn't seem, because dependent things are a fact. It seems as if every single part of the universe, whether we're talking about metals or human beings like me and P-Sam, for instance, we are dependent on something. We are dependent on a set of, or a plethora of physical conditions. It might be the atmosphere, it might be the pressure, it might be entropy, it might be even the laws of physics. The point being is that we are dependent on something. I can only talk to you because I breathe in oxygen and then I give out carbon monoxide in return. So that is essentially the contingency argument from the first premise, that anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. I talked about the chair earlier. The chair did not just generate spontaneously. It was welded, right? This laptop was made, or it was manufactured by engineers, right? It has an explanation of its existence. This building has an explanation of its own existence. The shoes we wear, from something as simple as a Nike shoe box to something as complex as a space rocket, every single thing has an explanation for its existence. In other words, every single thing is contingent. And that is what you would call the principle of sufficient reason. Next slide. Next slide. And that's what you call the principle of sufficient reason. Now, every dependent thing is what you call, or what Leibniz called, a monad, right? He calls it a monad, right? In the same way you call something, mono. Mono means one, right? And duo, two. So he calls it a monad. So I am a monad, this light is a monad, every single thing that is dependent is a monad. Now, as you can see in those 8 boxes within a circle, those 8 boxes are interconnected by certain arrows. It means that every single box has an explanation of its own existence dependent on another box. So that is why you see the arrows interconnecting them. It says that the property of every monad in the universe, just like the properties within one monad, are all interconnected in a vast network of explanation, as I explained earlier. Now, it says that according to the law of sufficient reason, or the principle of sufficient reason. Now, but what is the reason for the whole set of monads? And when we're saying the whole set of monads, what we're talking about is the universe that we dwell in. Like, as much as every single thing has an explanation for its own existence, how do we explain the universe? Leibniz asked, right? So let's go to the second premise, which is, if the universe, back to the second premise, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Now, the point is that many philosophers over through the ages have said that the universe did not need a cause, right? In as much as we can see that, the universe, any monad within the universe is dependent on something to be, the collection of the monad itself, which is the universe, as it's always existed forever. It doesn't need an explanation, right? And if you say if you say the universe needs an explanation, then why doesn't God himself need an explanation? And if you say God does not need an explanation, then why can't you just say the universe itself does not need an explanation? Now, how Leibniz counters this is that he makes the distinction between necessary things and contingent things, right? So I already explained what a contingent thing is. So a necessary thing is something that cannot cease to exist in any possible world. I'll try and explain that before I move on very quickly. In any possible world. So let's imagine, you've heard about the statement, this is the best conceivable world, or the best world conceivable, right? Right. So we could imagine a theory of a multiverse, for instance, where there is a Mo in another universe speaking even right now, or there is a Mo in another universe that's going to speak tomorrow. There are multiple universes. Those are possible worlds, right? So in all those possible worlds, it is possible that Mo does not exist. In a possible world, it's possible that giraffes do not exist. In possible worlds, it's possible that light in this way does not exist, right? These are all contingent things. But what Leibniz says is that in every given possible world, the necessary being would have to exist, right? And that necessary being would have in itself the explanation, right? So you could say, okay, what caused God? Now, there are two problems with asking what caused God. The first thing that is, it leads us to an infinite regress, right? And so you would then have to ask, what caused God who caused God? And then you have to ask what caused God that caused God that caused God ad infinitum. You could do that for 1 billion years raised to the 10th power, and you are still asking what caused God, right? So that's an infinite regress. And if that looks very confusing, one could also say, does God cause himself? No, God cannot cause himself. For somebody to cause themselves, it means that I would have to exist independently of myself or predate myself to cause myself. And that's just self-evidently absurd, right? So it means that, if the universe has an explanation for itself, that the explanation is God. So what Leibniz says is that God is the necessary being that brought forth this universe into existence. And the universe is contingent, God is necessary. And even atheistic philosophers agree with this. Atheistic philosophers like Michael Ruse and J.H. Sobel have all argued that yes, the infinite regress is valid. You cannot have an infinite regress at some point in time, right? It will have to terminate at an uncaused being. I've already said the problem is that you can't have an infinite regress and you cannot have a self-caused being. So it automatically follows that you have to have an uncaused being. This uncaused being God. All right. So next slide, principle of sufficient reason. So as Leibniz says, no, the previous one. Next one, yes, exactly, thank you. So as you can see the question mark, what Leibniz is asking that, what is the cause that brings forward, the whole set of monads? And so as Alexander Proust said, who is, people joke around that he's one of the smartest philosophers alive. He says that it will be a philosophical mistake to leave the pre-SR, that's the principle of sufficient reason, like I said earlier. The explanation that is needed is what you would call the principle of sufficient reason. So he said it will be a philosophical mistake to leave the pre-SR purely to theological uses. He says philosophy starts in wonder, and wonder impels us to find reason for things. And so we could also talk about, so if we go back to the Leibnizian cosmological argument, we know that the universe exists at some point in time. Modern science proves that. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. And if it has an explanation for its existence as a contingent being or thing, then it would be a necessary being that would have to cause it, which will be God. Now, the second one will be Kalam cosmological argument. I'll just gloss over it. It says that whatever begins to exist has a cause, which is the causal principle. Like we said, every effect has its cause as a predicate. It says the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And, we also established the necessity or the necessary nature of this being. One, he would have to be uncaused. Next slide. One, he would have to be uncaused because we've already established that you cannot have an infinite regress of causes, right? In the same time, you can also not have a self-caused being. It means you'd have a circularity of causes. Like I said, it makes no sense. So he would have to be uncaused and he would have to be beginningless, right? Because he has no beginning. He would also have to be changeless. He'd have to be timeless because he created time. So it makes sense that he would exist outside of time. And by so doing, or by consequence, it means he is eternal. He would have to be spaceless because he created time, space, and matter. And because he created matter, he would have to be immaterial. Now, one could argue that this could be the logical conclusion of Plato, for instance, or this could be the logical conclusion or the argumentative conclusion of Aristotle, that an impersonal God. But the point is, there's a law of logic you call the law of identity. It means that I cannot give a property that I do not have, right? So we see that we, me, you, as contingent beings, as monads, we possess intelligence and we are personal. So it automatically follows that if there is a necessary being that transmits these properties, you also follow that by the law of identity, he would have to possess intelligence and he will also have to be personal. I've got to hurry. So the beginning of the universe in light of modern cosmology, right? So, the Big Bang theory in the 20th century was finally expounded as a theory that works to explain the origin of the universe. We saw evidence from an expanding universe from Georges Lemaitre and Edwin Hubble. And then there's also a theorem called the Bode-Gut-Vilenkin theorem. That is, it's a theorem in cosmology which demonstrates that any universe on an average that has been expanding throughout its history, it cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. Now, I'm trying to explain that. So imagine if at this point here, there was an explosion that, the blast radius extends outside, right? But the point is, if we were to make an inference and if we could rewind time back, the thing is that you would have to see the blast go back to point A, right at this beginning. And so that's essentially what the Bode-Gut-Vilenkin theory says, that if a universe that has been expanding on an average throughout its history, it cannot have been expanding infinitely in the past. Now, the Big Bang simply shows that the universe has a beginning. The academia, of course, does not like this, right? Because as a certain British philosopher said, he said that naturalism, right, or physicalism, that is all that we see in the universe, that's all there is to it, right? There's no external being, there's no God, right? So he's saying that physicalism is the orthodoxy of academia. So it means that you have to presuppose physicalism or naturalism before you evaluate the evidence. And one thing you notice among the scientific community was that they did not want the Big Bang to be true, right? And they tried to circumvent that. We see in the history of the universe, next slide, we see in the history of the universe that there was a Big Bang and then you'd see the inflation as it spread. Next slide. So for instance, Alan McRobert, right, he's a contributor to the Sky and Telescope in 1983. He said that the idea of an oscillating universe, that's another model that explains the universe. He says that the idea of an oscillating universe in which the Big Bang resulted from the collapse of a previous state of the universe, said gained currency merely because it avoided the issue of creation, not because it had the slightest evidence in favor of it. As I.L. Rotenza would say in his Big Bang, Big Bounce, says that the only way to account for all these facts in the framework of physical concepts without invoking a metaphysical power is to admit a number of multiple universes. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying that because we want to make any metaphysical allusions, it's even more probable that we have a multiverse, that is an infinite number of universes, which is unscientific, non-empirical, and highly improbable, right? It's just as metaphysical as positing that God does not exist. Because you have more chance of having an intelligent being causing a universe to be than having multiple universes where you have Mo speaking to an audience just like this. And then I'll just try and simplify the contingency argument here, where it says that there are dependent beings, like we also admitted, like we established earlier. If there are dependent beings, then their existence must continually be sustained by something else. If dependent beings are continually sustained by something else, either in the chain of continually sustained dependent being regresses infinitely, or it terminates in a necessary cause, which we call God. The chain of sustained dependent beings cannot regress infinitely. Therefore, the chain of continually dependent beings must terminate in a necessary being, itself not sustained, being God. So here is a recommendation for anybody who might like to look into it. We have Necessary Existence by one of the most respected philosophers, Alexander Proust and Joshua Rasmussen. We've got Immanuel Rutten, and we've also got, the cosmological fine-tuning arguments. Now, if you need the slide, you can meet Jide later to obtain a copy. Now, moving on. Now, even if the Big Bang proves that the universe has a beginning, it does not demonstrate the existence of God, because it doesn't follow that because the universe has a beginning, therefore God. At best, what it does is that it creates a very firm basis to infer the existence of God. And if theism is true, then why Christianity as opposed to numerous religions, or as the atheists like to say in their tropes, what about the 3,999 gods? So in a sense, we'd have to use an elimination method here. I'm nearing the end of my presentation, so please bear with me. So the first, the two frameworks for understanding religion is essentially monotheism and polytheism, right? Monotheism being belief in one God, and polytheism being belief in many or multiple gods, right? And so I think I would take polytheism first. So polytheism, here are reasons why I feel like, or I don't feel like, here are reasons why I think that polytheism does not apply as a framework for our beliefs. One, the non-applicability of the evidence to a polytheistic worldview. We talked about the contingency argument and the Kalam cosmological argument. It leads to only one necessary being, not multiple necessary beings. It doesn't make sense to infer that there are multiple necessary beings, right? There can only be one necessary being. Very quickly, second, the disproportionate spatiotemporal distribution of belief. So what that means is that there are philosophers. I've read moral philosophy, and anything that you read in moral philosophy essentially tells you that meaning is fundamental to human beings, right? Everybody seeks meaning in their lives. And many atheist philosophers have also said that for you to get meaning, you would have to look to the transcendent. Some have called this a boundless meaning, like meaning that surpasses your five senses, right? And some even said that, it is philosophers, I think John Cottingham said that religions provide a perfect framework for meaning than any other worldview. These are atheists and agnostics admitting this. So if you have a disproportionate spatiotemporal belief, distribution of belief, it means that in Yoruba land, for instance, you worship Shango, or you worship Ogun, Oya, and so on and so forth. And in the Scandinavia, you worship Thor, you worship Odin, and in Greece, you worship not Odin, Zeus, thank you. Or you worship, all the pantheon, right, in Mount Olympus. Or in Egypt, you worship Osiris, and so on and so forth, or you worship Krishna, Vishnu, and Ra. You have disproportionate distribution of belief. And if a God truly exists, he would want to make sure that, that distribution of belief is proportionate, right? And so you wouldn't see this sparse distribution of beliefs. And also metaphysical plurality, right? It means that they all make claims, but then again, the claims of the Greek pantheon conflicts with the claims of the Roman pantheon, for instance. The claims of the Roman pantheon conflicts with that of the Yoruba pantheon. The claims of the Yoruba pantheon conflicts with that of the Norse pantheon. You all have a mumbo-jumbo of conflicting ideas. So at the end of the day, we also know that the law of non-contradiction says that two contradictory statements cannot both be true. It's either Mo is standing here by 11:35 a.m. wearing a black shirt, or Mo is standing here at 11:35 a.m. wearing a plaid shirt. It cannot be both at the same time, because those are two opposing statements. Now imagine when you have multiple conflicting religions. If there are any questions later, you can ask. So that would lead us then to monotheistic faiths. And I'd like to start with Judaism. So Judaism, they believe a lot of things like than I could possibly hope to condense here. But if you condense them, it goes only in two beliefs, two fundamental beliefs. One, ethical monotheism, and two, eschatological hope. For ethical monotheism are the ceremonial commands that, the Jews were given, the Levitical laws, the ceremonial laws that you would see in Leviticus Deuteronomy, and so on and so forth, right? That's ethical monotheism. And then for eschatological hope, which is where I'm, going to, is that the Jews would often go into captivity, right? And they often had the idea that there was a coming Messiah who would come and redeem them from the shackles of their captors, right? He would establish his kingdom and then he will reign forever and ever, right? But it was said that there would be, a Messiah that would come and fulfill this. I think I'm past my time, so I'm trying very much to hurry. So we see that Jesus Christ not only fulfills these messianic claims, but he rose again, right? You could check out the scriptures. But I think an argument that I see not often used for, the messiahship of Jesus is the Messiah in the minor prophets. And it is that when you read all the minor prophets, Zephaniah, Joel, Obadiah, they are always talking about the great day of the Lord, or an event that would precede the great day of the Lord. And when you read thoroughly, you would see that they were talking about the Messiah, that at some point in time, there would be a Messiah that would come and signal or usher the eschatological great day of the Lord, where the Lord shall wipe out his enemies. And then I'll read Malachi chapter 4, verse 5, next slide, where it says that, "Behold, I will send to you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. It says, he shall return the hearts of the fathers unto the children, and the hearts of the children unto their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse," right? It will make sense for why they were asking John that, "Are you that prophet, or are you Elijah?" Because they expected the coming of a Messiah. Now, Jesus Christ fulfills this. And if he fulfills this, that means Judaism has been eliminated in that sense, right? That would make Richard Oxenberg, who himself was a Jew, or is a Jew, would say that Christianity, properly understood, extends the core of the Jewish understanding of God to the rest of the world, something that polytheism does not do, right? It also made me understand, I think I remember what Voltaire said, when Voltaire said that if Judaism did not have Christianity, I think it would be necessary for Judaism to invent Christianity. For no one has been able to bring much attention to the Torah than Christians. And then there's also a recommendation that the Messiah in the Old Testament by Walter C. Kaiser, and Dominion and Dynasty, Theology of the Hebrew Bible, where he argues convincingly about the Messiahship of Christ. Now, on Islamic belief, I'm nearing my last slide now. On Islamic belief, it says that the necessity of belief in the biblical books is an article of faith. There are many ways you can there are many ways you could argue against Islam, right? But why I choose this is because Islam predicates its essence on the previous scriptures. So essentially it's saying that you have to believe in the Torah, in the Zabur, and the Injil. That's essentially in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, right? You could not, if you couldn't choose or select the article of faith you want to believe over the other. You'd have to believe all the articles of faith. And you'd also have to believe all the prophets, right? All the Old Testament prophets. But the point is that if you look through the entire text of the Bible, you'd see not as much as a slight typological allusion to Islam, right? And if Islam comes about 600 years after, and then it says that, okay, the validity of my claims is contingent on the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? The words of Jesus, the Gospels. And then you look through and then you don't find nothing. You automatically disqualifies the claims of Islam. I'd like to talk about Islamic fatalism, but I am out of time. But in any case, it's highly improbable that Islam is true on this criteria. And that leaves us with Christianity. Really, we know that the historical reliability of the New Testament is, beyond question. Even if you use ancient criticism and modern criticism, it still comes away as one of the most trustworthy materials of antiquity, right? But we see that the real problem that prevents skeptics from accepting the historicity of the New Testament is the fact that it has miraculous claims. That's it. I mean, it has more reputation going for it than Pliny or Livy or Plutarch or Arrian. These are all Roman historians, right? I put forward some quotes. Next slide. I put forward some quotes on the reliability of the New Testament. Like I said, you could get the slides if you need them. Now, the major miracle that happens in the New Testament is the miracle of the resurrection. Matter of fact, Paul hinges our faith on the resurrection, where he says that if Christ is not raised from the dead, ye are dead in your faith, or where ye are dead in your sins, right? So it means that if Christ is not raised from the dead, well, eat and drink, for tomorrow you die, Paul says. Now, the facts to be explained, this is the second to the last slide, so I'll be very quick. So the facts to be explained is the crucifixion, the empty tomb, and the disciples' belief in a resurrection. Now, it doesn't matter how skeptical you get. Every skeptical scholar, or I should say a vast majority of skeptical scholars, admits the fact of the crucifixion, the empty tomb, and the disciples' belief in a risen Jesus. You could say maybe they had an apparition, for instance. They saw an apparition, or they stole the body. But what you cannot argue against is the fact that the disciples believed that they saw something that would cause a transformative impact in their life. No historian denies this. Now, what would, because there are disbelief as to the event of the resurrection, scholars, maybe historians, philosophers of science will try to posit forward hypothesis that explains the given facts that we mentioned already. So, for instance, we have inference to the best explanation. It's a scientific method, right? Where it says that X would be the state of affairs that explains the body of facts and observation. The body of facts being crucifixion, empty tomb, and the belief, and the disciples' belief that they saw the risen Christ. Now, Q would, if true, explain X. I mean, if a certain hypothesis is true, or, it has more explanatory power, it should explain X. No other hypothesis can explain X as well as Q does. Therefore, with high probability, Q is true. And now the final slide. These are the alternative hypotheses for the resurrection. We have the hallucination hypothesis, for instance, where it says that that the disciples, because as a result of their grieving, right, they hallucinated Christ. And then they saw the risen Christ and therefore believed that Christ was risen from the dead. But there is absolutely nothing in the psychological studies, nor in cognitive psychology really, that demonstrates this, because it is contrived. Because when you read the New Testament, you see Jesus Christ appearing to the disciples not one time, but many times. You see that he appears not just to one person, but many people. You see that he appears not just in one place, but many places. There is nothing that accounts for this. If you say the stolen body, well, you had Roman guards there, right? The swoon theory, or the apparent death theory, which is that Christ, by a sheer sense of luck, survived his crucifixion, and then he crawled his way down to the disciples in their hideout, and then he convinced them that he was resurrected. Now, the point is, you don't see somebody who is, bleeding half to death and then logically convince yourself that they were resurrected. What you would think was that this person needed to be hospitalized or be taken to an inn to be treated. One of the worst is the conspiracy hypothesis, for instance, where it says that the disciples came together and conspired to steal Jesus Christ's body from the tomb. Makes no sense, really. And then, the substitution theory that is, while Jesus Christ was he was about to be crucified on the cross, Joseph of Arimathea. I'm sorry. So, Simon of Cyrene, was replaced, instead of Jesus, right? Simon of Cyrene was replaced instead of Jesus. And I think it's Muslims that usually, tout this view, right? And I think that if there are questions, I'll be willing to address them. And then the last one would be the cognitive dissonance theory. This is a relatively new theory. I think it was brought forward by Matthew Hartke. It has more explanatory power and explanatory scope, actually. I wish I could talk about it, but I do not have the time. But matter of fact, I interacted with Matthew Hartke and I wrote a response to the cognitive dissonance theory. And I think a couple of other people have written a response to cognitive dissonance theory. And, that's out of the way. But it has more explanatory power than the other ones. And then finally, the last slide. So we see that out of all these hypotheses, right, there is none that best explains the body of facts or the set of observations that we have on like the resurrection. It only makes sense that the disciples saw a risen Christ and were not only convinced, but were willing to give their lives for it and face ostracism as a result of that. So that would prove the validity of my arguments that premise one, that if Christian theism is true, as we've been able to demonstrate, then if Christian theism is true, it will entail superior explanatory power relative to Islam or relative to Judaism, which it fulfills, or relative to any other polytheistic belief. It does have more explanatory power. Of course, there might be objections, but I think there are good answers to that. Then premise two, if Christian theism entails superior explanatory power, then it means it's true. Therefore, Christian theism is true. That would be the end of my presentation. I'm so sorry, please, man.